Many, if not most, Zelda fans would agree that the Legend of Zelda franchise is responsible for some of the greatest games ever made. Yet, throughout the course of its history, Zelda, for the most part, has been second to Mario. Even with the most popular Zelda games before Switch era, Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, they were still second to their respective counterparts from each generation. Ocarina of Time sold less than Mario 64, Twilight Princess sold less than Mario Galaxy. However, after the critical response and lackluster sales of Skyward Sword, the Zelda team started to shift, and we saw a bit of that with A Link Between Worlds, introducing a more open level of exploration in terms of approaching the dungeon layout. But it was with Breath of the Wild and the launch of the Nintendo Switch where everything truly changed. A full open world, or open air as Nintendo liked to coin it. A level of freedom we hadn't seen in any prior Zelda game, or even in games in general when it comes to exploration. And with this game finally, Zelda surpassed the popularity of Mario. Breath of the Wild outdid Super Mario Odyssey. Yet throughout the generation, there were many fans suggesting that Breath of the Wild wasn't quite a Zelda game, not compared to prior 3D Zeldas. And then with Tears of the Kingdom, while it also saw great success, there was a great deal of fan feedback and critique. So much so that it feels like there's been quite a divide with the Zelda fanbase. But with this latest entry, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, it appears that this game has found a way to unite the fanbase once more. It appears that Echoes of Wisdom has fixed the Zelda formula. Now, what do I mean by fixed, and what does this suggest for future Zelda games? That's what we're getting into today on AndresRestart. Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and let's get right into things here. In order to explain how Echoes of Wisdom has fixed the Zelda formula, let's first talk about the problem with Tears of the Kingdom. And let me make myself clear with this one. I love Tears of the Kingdom. I think Tears of the Kingdom was a fantastic game that showed a clear level of progression in terms of improving the overall Zelda formula. But I also recognize there are elements about Tears of the Kingdom that not all Zelda fans would be in love with, and I think changes do need to be made for future games. The way I see it, with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, it was a departure for the series. They needed to try something new, and they found great success with it in a new direction for Zelda. And by going in this direction, they did boldly shy away from a lot of different Zelda tropes. However, looking at Breath of the Wild and the transition over to Tears of the Kingdom, I felt we saw some steady progression in bringing back of those other tropes, but marrying it to the now new open formula of Zelda. Many fans miss the linear storytelling from prior Zelda games. Story is a big part of Zelda, even if the story is figured out after sorting out the gameplay within development. And something else many fans have taken issue with are the dungeons. Dungeons used to be the priority. In Breath and Tears, they are no longer a priority and just included within the open world, and the way they're designed, well, it's left a lot to be desired compared to prior games. The dungeons in Breath of the Wild essentially all shared the same theme, and also a very similar puzzle hook. It was all about moving around the environment to find the terminals, and then you just fight the boss. In Tears of the Kingdom, I feel steps were made to improve some of these issues. With the story, there was a little bit more linearity introduced, and I felt the way they handled cutscenes was also vastly improved. The opening segment for Tears of the Kingdom I feel is one of the best, most exciting segments we ever seen to begin a Zelda game. And I also feel that there were some very powerful character moments with Princess Zelda throughout the flashbacks, and the way the game closed, I would argue, could maybe be the best ending to a Zelda game ever. But the fact of the matter is, while there was some level of linearity presented to the story in Tears of the Kingdom, there was still a lot that was open, and many do feel that took away from the story, and I agree to an extent. Finding all the memories in any sort of random order, there were scenes that were very powerful and intense that if you saw towards the beginning of your adventure, might take away from the other scenes you see later on. But something I felt that Tears of the Kingdom was doing a little bit of a better job of was also telling a story in the current time as you would explore the world with Link. However, when you would go and do the main dungeons, you'd be introduced to the story of the Imprisoning War, again, in the same fashion. It was repetitive and it took away from the overall narrative. Clearly, even with the experience from Breath of the Wild, there were some struggles in telling the story in a way that fits the open-air format for Zelda. And then with the dungeons, they brought in more unique epic boss fights, which we did miss in Breath of the Wild, and the dungeons took on a more unique format. Each dungeon felt like its own experience. However, the dungeons also carried over a very similar format to what we saw in Breath of the Wild, in the sense that you had to search around this map and find the terminals to get to the end boss. They still didn't feel quite like they did in prior Zelda games, nor did they feel like as much of a focus compared to prior Zelda games. And then once Echoes of Wisdom came along, and fans saw the trailers and saw how Zelda could do all these different things with her Bind ability and her Echoes ability, it seemed very similar to the kinds of abilities you saw with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So many fans were growing concerned that we were basically just going to see a 2D top-down version of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. And to some extent, this has held true, but not entirely. Before we continue on though, let me quickly ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Anyway, let me read you a few different quotes from this recent Ask the Developer interview having to do with Echoes of Wisdom. Now these quotes are coming from Eiji Aonuma, the series producer for The Legend of Zelda. In part 1, they were talking about the copy and paste gameplay as well as experience the game from both a top-down and side view. And then Aonuma said this: "These were the two basic elements, and from there I asked them to think of ways to add some freedom. Having worked on games in the Legend of Zelda series over the years, we started to feel that fans may not continue playing this franchise unless they can think independently and try various things freely on their own, rather than following a set path. Even when it comes to solving puzzles, in a game in the Legend of Zelda series, having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Legend of Zelda-like. Hence, we need to increase the degree of freedom to achieve that. With this in mind, I asked Grezzo to use those two elements as a foundation for the gameplay and add freedom on top of it." So with this quote here, some Zelda fans might have found it somewhat alarming considering the divide we saw with Tears of the Kingdom. Here Aonuma says having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Legend of Zelda-like. Essentially, Aonuma is talking about how the freedom we've seen in Breath and Tears, that is now a foundation of what a Zelda game is. That's how the series producer sees it. And quite frankly, I love this about the latest Zelda games. It might be my most favorite part. But as I argued in the past, when Tears of the Kingdom came out, they can still retain this freedom while incorporating other elements from prior Zelda games that help them to feel even more like a Zelda game, and there is a path to make an even better game than any other Zelda we've seen before. Now going to his next part from the interview, the Echoes of Wisdom team was asked, "There is certainly a history of Hyrule that ties the entire series together. If you take too many liberties, you have to be careful whether it's still Legend of Zelda-like." I guess that's actually more like a statement, but Aonuma responds and says, "Right. It's very difficult to balance how much to add or change. At first, we were intentionally leaving any parts that might delve into Hyrule's history vague, but partway through, we just couldn't find a way forward that way. So, around last summer, we decided to hold a boot camp and work out the story there." So I bring this up because I think it's interesting in terms of timing. Echoes of Wisdom has released just recently, September of 2024. Tears of the Kingdom came out in the prior year, May of 2023. Summer starts right around then. So it would be right after the events of Tears of the Kingdom where there would have been a lot of fan response in terms of how they handled that game. The Zelda team has proven to be receptive of fan feedback, and so here they're talking about how there needed to be a shift around last summer. I think this is Aonuma indicating that what happened with Tears of the Kingdom and the fan feedback led to a shift in the development for the Zelda series, including Echoes of Wisdom. But perhaps this next thing that Aonuma says is even more telling. These days, even for us, it's not easy to touch on the lore of the Legend of Zelda series. When you address the history of the Legend of Zelda, you naturally have to be conscious of how things have been expressed previously in the series. But when we think about a new game, we need to think about new developments while being mindful of the past games in the series. So the scope of what you can do becomes increasingly narrow if you think in the same way every time. On top of that, when the series has been running for a long time, players are interested in its history and lore. So when we've adopted a game plot that was not in line with the other games in the series because we prioritize the gameplay, we've been told by our fans that it didn't make sense. We realized that even if the developers didn't intend to make nonsensical changes, players could interpret otherwise. So I think this further solidifies how the controversy surrounding Tears of the Kingdom, that fan split, and the criticism surrounding the story led to a shift. Aonuma is acknowledging that the way they've handled story for prior Zelda games needs to be adjusted in some way. And so I think we've seen that with Echoes of Wisdom. This was an interview about Echoes of Wisdom after all. And so looking at Echoes of Wisdom, there are some interesting elements that carry over from Tears of the Kingdom. Absolutely, they've incorporated freedom that feels similar to Tears and Breath in Echoes of Wisdom. Being able to climb up very high and run on canopies or scale mountains, that's awesome. Or even being able to skip certain segments in dungeons, that's still all there. And the ability to solve puzzles in unique ways, it's just as great of an experience as it ever has been. But Echoes of Wisdom does limit your freedom in certain ways. The way the game opens up is actually very similar to Tears of the Kingdom, but there are a series of narrative events that need to happen before you can progress further. You actually have to beat an entire dungeon before the map opens up more. And at this point, once you beat this dungeon, there is another wave of dungeons that are spread throughout the map that you can then explore. And you can choose to go to other areas. And I did this very early on. I explored the Faron region when there wasn't any story or objective I needed to accomplish in that part of Hyrule. And it proved to be a very challenging area with very little story things going on. I could talk to certain characters there, but there wasn't any sort of narrative event that was taking place. There were some side quests, but there was a limitation there clearly. And so there were only certain areas I could go to where things would transpire. And then once you beat these wave of dungeons, there is then another linear segment of events that you have to accomplish. And then once you beat those, another wave of dungeons opens throughout the map. And it's at this point where I would say it's maybe like about the half point in the game, pretty close to it. And the map feels pretty much about as open as it's going to be. The game feels like it truly opens up and you could explore around how you so choose. And it should be noted, the reason why at this point the game feels like it opens up so much is in part because there are now multiple areas that you have full access to in terms of story progression, but also by this point in the game, you have developed your echo power so much because every time you beat a dungeon, it expands. And so it's become a lot easier to take advantage of your echoes to do so much more, providing a feeling similar to prior Zelda games where as you expand your repertoire of abilities and items, you can do so much more. And each dungeon is an experience with its own dedicated story, and let's call each of these experiences their own respective episodes. These episodes can be experienced in either order because they don't affect the overall main plot in terms of Zelda, they simply give you more perspective and tell a story about a particular region and people of the world. But once you beat these waves, you will then experience another linear experience towards the end of the game. And so, looking at this method, I do think this is a way to handle Zelda moving forward. I do think this fixes the Zelda formula. And the dungeons we experience in between also, I feel, are more in line with prior Zelda games. Bringing back the boss key, bringing back the map, those make a big difference. And while there is a certain level of freedom we see in Echoes of Wisdom even within the dungeons, there's also a great deal of limitation. Looking at an ability like Ascend in Tears of the Kingdom, I think may have been something they should have adjusted somewhat. I love Ascend, But I think being able to use Ascend to essentially skip to the very end of a dungeon, I think they probably should have created more surfaces that you can't ascend through. It would have been a simple fix. Ascend still would have been a very valuable ability to have, and you still would be able to use it in dungeons at times, but I do think a lot of dungeons should have simply had surfaces that would block your ability to ascend through it. Because I do think there needs to be some limitation. While I do really enjoy the freedom and being able to solve things and do things in a way that it seems like I wasn't intended, even in some cases where I can skip certain areas, being able to skip the bulk of a dungeon, I don't think that works really well. Now, I did mention you can make skips in the Dungeons and Echoes of Wisdom, but because there is a boss key that you need to acquire, there's only so much that you can skip. And so I think the boss key also makes a big difference here. It creates another mandatory point that you need to get to, and not just one. And so even though we have this great level of freedom and we can do all these crazy things with our abilities, having this other point makes the dungeon not as easy to completely break and skip through. Or in the case of Echoes of Wisdom, seemingly impossible. And I do think it's these elements that Echoes of Wisdom has presented that help to fix the Zelda formula. Having multiple linear segments with waves of openness, having even more of your abilities progress as you delve further into the game, and then the boss key and a bit more restrictiveness within the dungeons. But what you might notice is that I've put fixed in quotes in the title for the video, because I don't think Echoes of Wisdom has fully fixed the formula for Zelda, because I think what they did with Echoes of Wisdom works for Echoes of Wisdom. This format I think works for 2D top-down Zelda, so I want them to continue this with the next game. If they were to follow the exact same formula but for 3D open-air Zelda, I might be a little upset. Because while I did enjoy the increased level of freedom in terms of exploration in Echoes compared to prior 2D top-down Zeldas, the level of freedom of exploration in Echoes of Wisdom in comparison to say something like Breath or Tears is still vastly limited. You can get to the borders of the map quite quickly, and there are a lot of invisible barriers. I don't like seeing that. That takes away from the adventure. It's okay for 2D top-down Zelda, but with the next 3D Zelda, if I see a mountain wall that I can't actually scale in some way, that I can't actually interact with, it's going to feel lesser than Breath and Tears, because you can in those games. You can interact with any space within the entire map of Hyrule in theory. And so with the next 3D Zelda, I do think they need to maintain this open air format. But that doesn't mean they can't still have pockets of linearity and waves of freedom like Echoes of Wisdom. That can still be done. And once you're within the dungeons, they can increase the restrictiveness somewhat. I would like the dungeons to be fitted within their own world, and perhaps they aren't separate load-in zones, but there need to be things about these dungeons that you can't just completely break and skip to the end quite quickly. I agree with that. Keep boss keys, keep the dungeon map. That helps the dungeons feel more like proper Zelda dungeons. And I do hope that with future games they focus more on these dungeons. I want to see the big, massive dungeons with cool, elaborate concepts that are unique to each respective dungeon. But I would also like to mention another third future for Zelda here, because I do believe we're going to get more 2D top-down Zelda, and I also believe we are absolutely going to get more open-air Zelda. Both are in the works, both are happening. But I've also theorized that Nintendo will revisit Ocarina of Time in the not-so-distant future. And if it's not Ocarina of Time, maybe it's Twilight Princess, maybe it's Majora's Mask, maybe it's all three at some point down the road. Yes, all these games have been remastered, but I do think they need to be remade, and with some changes that perhaps help the games to fit more within the modern mold. So looking at Ocarina of Time specifically, Ocarina of Time already feels a little bit of like how they handled Echoes of Wisdom. There are moments of linearity, but there are also waves of openness. You can do the fire or water dungeon in either order. You can do the spirit or shadow dungeon in either order. I think if they were to revisit this game, they should make some adjustments where they build on this a little bit more. Still have these linear story moments that you have to do before moving on, but there are also these different waves where you can explore the world how you choose and do certain things in either order. Build on that just a little bit more. And perhaps also with the dungeons, change around the puzzle somewhat so there does feel like there's a little bit of that freedom there. Not a lot, because I think the restrictiveness is important to the dungeons, but some tweaks here and there in terms of how some abilities work and how some puzzles react might make for an even more interesting game that will help to fit a modern standard. But those are all of my thoughts regarding how The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom has fixed, quote unquote, the Zelda formula moving forward. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.